What is a game without camera controls? Pikmin has some pretty unique camera controls, which I am trying to emulate. In Pikmin, you don't have complete control over the camera, which makes this different from some other games. I'll show you what that means with a real camera before we jump into Godot. By default, we have the camera in this position I like to call over the shoulder, and the player can move around, and the camera is generally anchored, but in the same direction, independent of the direction the player is facing. There's then 3 controls you can toggle between. One is the angle. It helps sometimes to have a bird's eye view, which you can toggle between. You can also change the zoom level. There's near, medium, and far. Finally, of course, you sometimes want to turn the angle, so when you want the camera to come behind the player, there's a button for that too. So here we are in Godot, the Godot game engine. I wanted to start with something simple in order to help me learn the engine. Now, I'm no stranger to game engines. I'm very familiar with Unity and pretty comfortable in Unreal, but Godot was a brand new one for me. I did a few tutorials, and now I have this. So I've got the classic capsule collider as a stand-in for the player. This triangular schnoz on the front is to know what direction the player is facing, which is very important, as you will see. Pikmin has relatively unique camera controls. Usually, you can just take a controller and use the analog stick that's held with the right thumb to aim where the player is, where the camera rather is looking, whereas the left thumb controls where you're moving. The left thumb stands, but the right thumb is used for something else in Pikmin, which I will get to in a later video. So the camera is relatively fixed in angle until you press some of the buttons, which I will now show on screen. This is from the Pikmin wiki. There are 3 things you can do with the camera. Facing the camera forward, I like to call it camera back because the camera is being brought behind the player, which is how you rotate it. Then there is the camera's distance, so you can have 3 zoom levels. And then finally there's the camera's angle, so you can have a normal over the shoulder type of deal, or you can have like a sort of bird's eye type of deal. I'll demo it real quick and then we'll get into the code. So I'm playing right now with this controller plugged into my computer. It's just a default Xbox controller. You can see I can run around, it's no big deal. Those blocks in the environment are just to make obvious that I am moving because the plane I am on does not have much of an indicator. In the top left you can see the debug info. So here is swapping between the camera angles. Here is the zoom level at which you can also change the camera angles. And then finally, when you press L, you turn to face a different direction, which is pretty cool. Now, if you try to do that while moving, there's a bit of lag where the nose kind of swings around real quick, which I'm not a fan of, and I need to play some more Pikmin and like get a vibe for what it actually should do. And of course, all of these transitions should not be instant. There should be some sort of smoothing involved. But again, what we're going for here is an absolute minimum viable product. And as far as week over week, that is also a minimum viable product. I do want to have the camera eventually be smoothing, but again, I wanted to get done the bare minimum for this video here, and this is what I got done in a week. I will add the smoothing as soon as I can. So then looking at my checklist, that's what we have for Pikmin. Now we'll talk about how I implemented it. So going here to the scripts, they're just called GD script. Pretty clever that Godot and GD both stand for game design and game development. My college degree was in GDD, game design and development. So I'm not going to go into the full spread here. I recommend you watch some tutorials. The tutorials I used will be linked in the description, but I will go to a few things here. One thing that is a little different from in Unity is you can do these little percentage tags to actual things that are on the player. I should pull that up quick. We start in the 3D actually. So here's the player, there's the nose. So there's this one thing here that's a camera pivot. It's not an actual object, it's just a reference to a transformed place in space. The Y value is to make it in the middle of the player's head, and the rotation is to give it a default angle, which is approximately what we call the over-the-head angle. Childed to that is this camera spring arm, which very importantly has this length, and this is the length we vary when it's time to zoom. The rotation of the camera pivot in the X plane is what we change when we change the angle. And then of course the camera itself is a final child of all of that. The thing that's not obvious here is how the rotation is handled, and that was actually the hardest one because I had to tweak the tutorial, which was using player input to always have control over it. So if we go back to the script, we can see here a handful of things. I hard-coded just what the zoom distances should be. These are not final. I just picked random numbers that felt near, close, and far. There's also the angles here, which are in radians. If you don't know what that means, you gotta Google it. But these are just the two angles we use, over the shoulder and the bird's eye. And then I also use these enums so that I could just use the word instead of worrying about the radian calculation every time. There is a current angle enum. This might be overcomplicated, I'm not sure. There's some other nonsense which we're not going to get into, but then the actual input is handled here. If you press camera angle, camera back, or camera zoom, which I have matched to the left bumper, the left trigger, the right trigger, and the right bumper, it would have been Z on a GameCube controller, but controllers don't have Z buttons nowadays. And these each call their respective function. So toggle camera angle is pretty easy. If the angle is bird's eye, we switch to over the shoulder. If the angle is over the shoulder, we switch to bird's eye, and we touch the rotation X on that camera pivot I mentioned earlier, and then we do a little log just so it's very obvious what happened. This is also useful for debugging, and I'm not going to get rid of these until it's time to actually share the code with people. Then there's camera zoom. This one's even easier. It's the same thing, only there's 3 options. And I didn't bother with an enum here. It's just if the spring length is the middle, we go to far. If it's far, it goes to close, and if it's close, it goes to middle with debugs each time. And then finally, although it is just one line, it took me a while to figure this out here because there's different terms in Godot than what I'm used to. So we do camera back. The camera pivots rotation in the Y plane, which is like the general rotation you would think of if you're using gravity or standing. If you turn your head left or right, it's in the Y plane as far as Godot is concerned. So the skin is the player's skin, the thing that's actually rotating. I learned that my player isn't turning, it's the skin of the player that's turning. That may come back to bite me. And then it's global rotation, not its relative rotation, it's rotation relative to the world, which we call global. And then we copy that Y, and then we are set. So once again, back to the world as I wrap this up. I think I checked all my boxes. Oh yeah, final phase. How would this look in my game, which is to be a Pikmin-like? I think that this is going to stay the same for a long time. If in playtesting it comes to pass that people hate this, then so be it. I'm not too attached to it. It's just what I'm used to from Pikmin. I'm not sure that this camera style is required for Pikmin's gameplay. I'm partial to it, I like it, and I think it's fun. I like having these miscellaneous controls that are like rigid. You don't have full control over the camera, but maybe full control is what people want. I don't know. But I won't belabor the point. This has been week 1 of remaking Pikmin and Godot. I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.